I always start out with a sort of crucial first statement when I'm teaching a course on African history. We are, all of us, all human beings, we are Africans. We are Africans because our common human ancestral communities, the ancestors of all human beings alive everywhere in the world today, they lived in the eastern parts of Africa, beginning around 70,000 years ago. That's when our ancestors reached their full capacities with syntactical language and all the capacities to exchange ideas, to think abstractly that we have today. I start with a comment, of course, that we are all Africans. And that's because, as I've said, our common ancestral communities arose in Eastern Africa. We retained our full modern linguistic capacities to think abstractly, to use language in all the complex ways, and so begin to be the human beings that we all are today. And no later than around 50,000 years ago, and some scholars argue even somewhat earlier, our descendants, the descendants of those common ancestors of all of us, began to spread out across the rest of the world, and also to spread out across the rest of the African continent. And here's a key thing to help us all understand this. It's not the continent of a single type of people. You know very well, dealing with people outside African continent, they somehow have an image of Africans as some single kind of people. No idea of how diverse it is. They have an image of, oh, maybe somebody from southern Nigeria. That's what all Africans look like and are. And of course, that's not true. Africa, and here's the key point on genetic side, it is in fact the most diverse continent of all. The ancestors of all the human beings who moved out from the continent 50,000 years ago and onward, they represent just one subset of that African diversity. So Africa has not been, here's our second key point that I always start out with in teaching, it's not been someplace off the edge of the world in its own particular place. Those of our ancestors who spread out after 50,000 years ago across the whole of the African continent, they didn't become some backward, unchanging people. And I always also hit on this. This is not something that visitors to Africa thought 1,000 years ago. It's something that has come to the fore. It's been invented by people who 400 years ago and onward have had to justify it to themselves why they were enslaving, mistreating other human beings. So now we have to look back and think about African history in a proper, balanced way and understand it. Africans were participants in, they were contributors to all the main lines, the main directions and developments that lead down to the world we live in today, where we create instruments and machines that make us more efficient, able to produce products that we couldn't produce before. Well, in all of world history, it now appears that the first invention of the weaving of cotton textiles took place in the eastern part of the Sudan belt of Africa already, in fact, would say before 5000 BCE, in the 6th millennium BCE. Now that's earlier than in India, and that's the country that historians usually mark out as the earliest place of this kind of technology. By the way, people in the Americas independently invented cotton weaving from cotton plants that were native to their part of the world. So this again is one of these kind of key inventions leading down to our modern world, that Africans and people in other parts of the world were independent contributors to that. But to look at the African evidence, let me quickly give you an image that you can look at. This is from a key site near the modern city of Khartoum. And here are the images that we might see. On the right, you see two of the spindle whorls. And for thinking about how technology interacts technological discoveries interact with each other. These spindle whorls were made of ceramic. They're ceramic. They're ceramic spindle whorls. If you know of maybe rural cotton weaving in West Africa, you might recognize this is the typical shape of spindle whorls in Africa. It's just in West Africa, they tend to be made out of wood, but these very ancient ones were ceramic. The archaeologists that first looked at this material said, oh, there must be fishing weights. These people were not experts in textile archaeology, and so they didn't recognize the two on the right. The one on the left, yeah, it may well have been a fishing weight used to weight the fishing lines of people who lived in this ancient site. It now appears also in the history of metallurgy that Africans had a particularly innovative role. It now appears that in the locations in Western Central African Republic and adjacent areas in Cameroon also, there were people living who invented, now appears, the earliest ironworking technology in history as early as 2000 BCE, and possibly earlier, 2100, 2200 from some of the sites. Now, what you always learn in history books is about another separate independent invention of ironworking. It took place around sometime a bit before 1500 BCE, just slightly later than the African development. It's the one we talk about, it's the one we learn about. It took place in what's today in the modern day country of Turkey. Now, let's go back to our African history though. From that separate and independent African beginning, iron technology then spread over the course of the next 2000 years across the whole of the rest of the continent south of the Sahara, even to people who were still trying to keep to being hunting and gathering and keep from having to do all the labor of farming. Even those people began to use iron technology. And just to give you a sense of the high quality of smithing and forging developed in Africa, here's from the last 2000 years in the Congo Basin, a rather frightening looking throwing knife. It was more used ceremonially than actually in battle. And on the right, you see a flanged welded double bell. The African smiths developed the sort of techniques where they could weld in the forge different sheets of iron, weld and shape them together to make an object as intricate as this double flange welded double bell. This was used typically as a ornament of an artifact, implement of chiefship or kingship. So a second little thing just to mention here to connect up with also, it appears also that iron smelters in East Africa around 2000 years ago, a little bit before, a couple 300 years before, discovered how to construct furnaces that generated such hot temperatures that they could produce carbon steel directly from the smelt. Not quite the quality of carbon steel that people can do today, but nevertheless, carbon steel. Chinese smelters did develop this capacity by around 1,000 years ago or so, but Westerners did not gain Europeans this capacity until the adoption of the Bessemer process, not all that much longer than a century and a half ago. So think again, if you think Africans were backward in technological developments. And then still a further important feature that needs to be told when we talk about African history. Africans in the Sudan belt of Africa had begun to create networks of long distance trade. In case you thought this was something that just began with the Middle East or the Mediterranean. And out of these developments, particularly skilled groups of skilled artisans were the producers of goods and the stimulators of these developments, but there began to be people who carried the goods between over the long distances, people who began to take on the roles of merchants, and towns began to emerge as the focal places of manufacturing. We're talking about as much as almost 4,000 years ago in Africa, south of the Sahara. And here are the ruins, just to give you a sense of some of the scale of development going on. The ruins of a town from far southern Mauritania, just on the borders of modern day Mali. So it's south of the Sahara. Look at the implications of this has for how we think wrongly and so often in the past thought wrongly about African developments. Now, then as we go into the last millennium BCE, between 1000 and 500, these African networks of commerce began to link up with the other networks of commercial exchange that were emerging in the same era. Networks that began to have merchants as the primary carriers in the Eastern Mediterranean particularly, but then spreading out through the Middle East and all the length of the Mediterranean, and in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea regions. And goods began to pass now in this period along several trans-Saharan trade routes. The African people, the Garamantes of the Sahara, were important linking people, making those connections. And goods also began to move by land connections to the Red Sea, and then by sea connections reached back the land connections from the Sudan to the Red Sea and from the Horn of Africa, and then via the Red Sea, these trade networks were linked up to the Mediterranean and to the Indian Ocean networks. So to sum up, Africa has not been at all a continent cut off from the rest of humanity, from the rest of our history. It has not been some world of backward lands and backward peoples isolated from world history, unchanging. However much the colonialists and the slavers before them might have wished that to be true, might have wished so because they could rationalize to themselves why they were behaving in such inhumane fashions. Africa instead has been a continent of peoples who actively contributed to, who actively participated in the formative long-term developments of human technological history and human economic history. And there's one closing lesson we need to talk about, I think, as well. And it's a lesson of considerable importance, I think, for planning and for carrying out investment and development all across Southern Eurasia in earlier history, from the farthest parts of East Asia, east to the Iberian Peninsula in the west, westward to the Iberian Peninsula in the west. Patriarchal societies who control women's behavior. That's been the norm for thousands of years. These are societies that hindered women's agencies and initiative. But these are the societies that people who wrote our early history books came out of, and they presumed this to be the world situation of women in earlier history. But in Africa south of the Sahara, women have not been necessarily or even usually historically subordinated to men, despite the tendency of the incoming Western colonialists and other outsiders to assume so. So whether in patrilineal or in matrilineal societies, women from far back in African past, they have been and they continue today to be independent social and economic actors in the trades and occupations. And this is important for us when we work in development and so on, that women carried out. They were the owners of the products of their labor. And as people often know, the major commercial entrepreneurs in recent centuries, Southern Nigerian history is important, but Nigeria in general, have often been women and not just in Nigeria at all. And these entrepreneurs, this is also true of the trade networks in the middle of the Congo Basin 1,000 years ago. And these entrepreneurs have not been just followers of older African religions, but even people who have become Muslims have continued these older African presence of women as important actors in economy and society, and of course, Christian women as well. This is an ancient African background. We have to be aware of it when we deal with development and with investment.